Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of BMSC Live. We're here at Eagle Bay in Bamfield, British Columbia, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, in the traditional territory of the Huu-ay-aht First Nations. My name is Kelly. I'm an educator at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Centre, and we are a not for profit registered Canadian charity. We're also a shared campus of 5 different universities, which are the University of Victoria, Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, and the University of Calgary. For almost 50 years, we've been hosting researchers who come from all over the world to do their studies here in Bamfield. We also run 4 credit university courses as well as field trips for school groups. Today's show is brought to you by the Bamfield Marine Sciences Centre with funding from NSERC Promo Science. They've been supporting our educational programs for many years now, and without their support, this program would not be possible. So big thank you to NSERC Promo Science. I'd also like to thank a recent donor, Jennifer, for her contribution to BMSC and also for introducing a fun new component to today's show. We're actually going to be giving away a BMSC toque to one of you viewers here today. And Phil's going to give you some instructions on how to do that in just a moment. So let me introduce you to my team. You may have met them before if you've been watching some of our previous shows. Behind the camera today, we have Olivia. Let's flip our camera around so that you can see Olivia. There she is. She's wearing a lot of technology in a backpack, and that's enabling us to bring you this show here today. So thank you for filming this, Olivia. And we also have Phil back in the lab, who is managing the technology side of things and helping to monitor the comments coming and going. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil for just a moment.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm here looking after the chat, and we need to remind you that, so we have a contest today. Those of you who send in comments and questions, we'll put your name in a bowl, and at the end of the show, we will do a draw for this Bamfield Marine Science Center toque. One thing to know, if you are a winner from YouTube, you will have to send us your contact information. We'll get to that later. Well, first, we like to share with you where we are in the world. And so here we have our Google Earth map. The Bamfield Science Center, so Vancouver Island is on the west side of Canada right here. And as we zoom in, you see that we have this large body of water right here that is called Barkley Sound. And Bamfield is kind of the southeast corner of Barkley. So here we have all of Bamfield. Science Center is right on this point, right there, main building there. And Kelly and Olivia today are coming from Eagle Bay, a beach at Eagle Bay. So they crossed the Bamfield Inlet right there, parked at the dock, and then Eagle Bay right here. And they're coming at you from sort of the northeast side of Eagle Bay, right in that spot, right? All right, so enjoy the show, everybody. We'll catch up with you later. Back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Phil. So just a reminder that I would love it if you guys could type in questions and comments as this show goes along. Both Phil and Olivia will help to relay your comments to me. You can just use either the chat function or the comments function, and we'll get back to those as the show goes on. Feel free to type away. So here we are in the intertidal zone at Eagle Bay. And you might be wondering, well, what is the intertidal zone? What are we even studying here today? It turns out that around 2 times a day, at least in Bamfield, it's about twice a day, the tide comes in. And when it comes in, it means that the water level on the shoreline rises up. And behind me, you can actually see the mark of where high tide would be. It's right at the top of this seaweed behind me. So at the top of that kind of brownish colored band on the shoreline, that's how far up the water would go at high tide. And where I'm standing, I'd be totally underwater if it was high tide. But right now it's low tide, or it's almost low tide in a few more minutes. The water has receded for low tide, and there's this whole section of the beach now that's exposed at low tide. And it turns out there's lots of creatures that live in the intertidal zone in that area where sometimes it's underwater, sometimes it's not underwater, and they have a whole bunch of special adaptations that allow these creatures to live in this environment. So it's a pretty cool place, but it's also a very challenging place to live. There's a lot of difficulties that creatures have with living in this environment. So there's your first question that you can think about answering here today. What are the challenges that animals living in the intertidal zone face? Why is it so hard to live here versus in other habitats? Think about that and type in your answers. We'll come back to those in a second. While you're thinking, let's have a look at some of our first animals of the day. They happen to be right by my feet here when we started out. You may have seen them from some of our other shows if you've been watching other episodes of BMSC Live, same species, even though some of them are purple or even sometimes reddish colored, and some of them are orange, they're actually the same type of animals. And these guys are really good at surviving low tide. They kind of just wait it out. So they're not even hidden super well. They're just right here on the rocks. And they're stuck very firmly to these rocks too. I'm trying very hard to pull one off the rocks and it's not happening. There's no way that I'm going to be able to remove the sea star from the rocks. And the way that it's sticking so tightly to the rocks is because underneath they have a whole bunch of suction cups on their underside, and they stick down to the rocks with so much force that a human can't even pick them up. So that's a great defense that keeps them from getting eaten. And the way that their suction cups work is what's called a water vascular system. Now, don't worry if you've never heard that word before, it's okay. It's kind of the equivalent of our circulatory system. So inside of our bodies, we have blood that's circulating around all of our tissues. With sea stars, they have water circulating around inside all of their tissues. And the water is also helping to keep them cool and survive this kind of challenging environment in the intertidal zone. So that's one way that these animals have adapted to being out of the water for some hours of the day, which is really cool. So they're fine here. They're okay until the tide comes back up in a couple of hours, and they'll just wait it out. No big deal. Are there any questions coming through yet? Remember, if you ask a question, then we can enter your name into the draw later on. Anything coming from YouTube, Phil?
No, but through our Zoom audience, Dave says, getting your brains bashed in on rock all day. I guess that would be one of the hardships of living in the intertidal zone.
Yeah, definitely. So when the tide does come back in, the wave action here is really strong and it's crashing on the rocks all day long. So literally these animals are getting bashed around by the ocean all the time. So in the case of those sea stars, they're able to stick onto the rocks really tight and they can just withstand that. A lot of the other animals here, they're kind of hooked into crevices in the rocks. There's some snails here that are in the little crevices and that offers them some protection from the waves. The seaweeds that grow here, they have a really strong little stem that just attaches them to the rock. So, I mean, I could pull that off if I wanted to. I don't want to, but it's pretty sturdy and it keeps them in place when the waves are crashing hard against the rock. So that's an excellent adaptation that these animals have and these seaweeds have in the face of the intertidal zone. You might have noticed down here, there's another strange animal. I love to point out the weird ones. Have you noticed? So this purple thing with the holes in it, that's called a lavender sponge. And sponges are, in fact, animals. I know they don't look like it, but they are. They're very primitive animals, though. There's not much to them. They don't even have a brain. Although, for that matter, the sea stars didn't have a brain either. But because it's a sponge, when I touch it, it's very squishy and soft. And that's another way that that animal can actually retain some of its moisture. So while the tide is out, it just kind of holds extra water inside of its tissues. It doesn't dry out and it stays healthy. Not too many species of sponges can actually live in the intertidal zone, but that lavender sponge is one of the ones that can do it. So that's a cool feature here today. Okay, so there's a question on Zoom about sea star wasting disease, and it's a great question. The ochre stars that you're seeing here on the beach today are looking very healthy, and that's good. But in the past, the sea stars on the BC coast and actually the whole west coast have been impacted by a disease called sea star wasting disease. Turns out it's actually a virus. It's kind of like the coronavirus equivalent for the sea stars here. And what would happen when they got this disease is their limbs would sort of fall off. They'd turn all white and ugly looking and they'd just fall off, and it would kill the sea stars, unfortunately. And it affected all kinds of different sea stars, including our ochre stars. But certain years, 2015, 2016, those years it was really bad. So far this summer, we're not really seeing signs of sea star wasting disease, which is really good news. A lot of our local sea star populations are starting to recover. We're not entirely sure what caused the virus, but we do know that it is worse in years where the temperature is really high. So there's some part of the temperature playing a role there, but we still don't fully understand what's happening with sea star wasting disease. We just know that so far our ochre stars are doing well this year. So thank you for that question. Let's have a look around some more. Let's see what other animals we can find on our beach. And it turns out that many of the creatures, the sea stars are kind of hiding in a nook there, but lots of other creatures are behind me on the beach and they're hiding underneath the rocks. So let's take a look and see what types of animals those might be. We're gonna line this up so that you guys can see. I'm just gonna pick a random rock here. Let's get Olivia down here so that you guys can see what's underneath. And let's just have a look. Are you ready? Here we go. Whoa! Nice. You guys see all those scurrying crabs? There's so many under there. This is a beautiful example of a porcelain crab in my hand here. It has sort of a blue bit to its carapace or its shell. And this particular one, I don't have to worry about it pinching me. Even though it does have fairly large looking pinchers, they aren't really harmful to me. They're more for show. They make it look scary to predators, but they don't actually use them to pinch people, this particular one. This one is exploring my hand quite a lot. If I flip it over, I'm not sure if it might be too small for you guys to see this at home, and it doesn't want to be flipped over. This crab is a girl, and I can tell because on the underside of her shell, it's sort of shaped like an igloo. I'll try and find a better one in just a moment to show you where you can actually see if it's a boy or a girl. I'll try and explain that a little bit better. For now, though, I'm going to put this porcelain crab back down under the rock. And you can see all of the crabs that were there, they've now scattered into the surrounding area and found new places to hide. But this is a great adaptation of the animals living in the intertidal zone. They just hide under the rocks. They stay hidden from predators, but also they stay cool. They don't heat up as much. If it was a really hot, sunny day, they would remain cool underneath the rock, and they can just, again, wait until the tide comes back up. They're good for a couple of hours. Let's do that again. Let's pick a new rock. And remember, you guys can ask questions as the show goes along. Let's see. Maybe this one. Let's try it. All right. Here we go. Oh, there are so many porcelain crabs under here. I couldn't even count them. There were so many, and they're all scurrying out of the way, finding new crevices and rocks to hide in. There's also a snail here stuck right to the rock. This is black turban snail is the name of this one, and it is a common snail in the intertidal zone. They can last for many hours while the tide is out, and if they need to, if they're losing too much water, they're heating up too much, they can just hide inside their shells until the tide comes back up, and they're just fine. Now we'll see later on, there's another animal that sometimes uses the shells of the black turban snail, and I'll introduce you to that in a bit. I think there's a question coming through. The question is, how big do porcelain crabs get? And the answer is not too much bigger than what you saw. Probably about this size is the average adult porcelain crab. So they're not like the big kind that humans might be eating. They're just little guys, and they're very common underneath the rocks on our beach. Good question.
That's
Let's
something
keep
from
looking.
YouTube, Kelly.
Yeah, there's a YouTube question.
So Claire mentioned that when you were asking about what we might find under the rocks, she said maybe some crabs.
Great.
Also on YouTube, Andy049 asks, when bears are in the intertidal flipping rocks around, are they just eating mostly purple short crabs or porcelain crabs? Anything else? So what do you feel bears are eating when they're out there?
Great. So you guys were both right. Claire mentioned that we'd find crabs under the rocks, and we are finding lots of crabs. We'll do that one more time and you can see another rock. The other question about bears in the intertidal zone, I love that, because what I'm doing here, flipping the rocks over with my hands, bears do exactly the same thing. If anyone's ever gotten a chance to see a bear do this, it's really funny. They just take their paws, and they sort of just paw over a rock, and then whatever crabs happen to be hiding underneath, they can sort of eat them up. And you know what? I don't think they're particularly specialized in what type of crabs they're eating. I think they'll eat both shore crabs, porcelain crabs, whatever kinds of crabs they happen to find under a rock, they'll just eat those. And this is a great way for them to find food in other times of the year where maybe there aren't a lot of berries or plants for them to eat. They can always be eating crabs on the beach. Thank you for that question. There's another one coming in on Zoom. Okay, so the question is what are the predators of the crabs, and why do they have claws that are for show rather than for defense? Some crabs do have claws that are for defense. They will in fact pinch you. I haven't found any on the beach big enough that will pinch today, but I'll try and show you later on. But it's true. Some of them they just have their claws for show, and it's just a visual cue to predators that makes them look scary, but they don't actually do anything, and that's special for the porcelain crabs. Oh, right. Olivia just reminded me that sometimes porcelain crabs will drop off a claw. So if something is threatening them, if there's a predator chasing them, they just drop an arm. Sounds crazy, I know. But then the crab can usually get away even without an arm. The predator can go after the arm and eat that. But the crab itself just goes and hides, and then eventually it can grow a new arm. Takes a while, but doesn't kill the crab to lose an arm. So that's also a defense mechanism that they have, which is pretty cool. Great, let's keep going. Let's find another good rock to flip. We're in a little bit of a tide pool section here. Actually, before we flip another rock, let's look at this thing right here on the shoreline. I know you guys are here for the animals, but I gotta talk a little bit about the seaweeds in the intertidal zone too, because they live here as well. This one wasn't actually growing here. I just washed it in the last time that the water was up here. But this one has a fun name. It's called acid weed. And acid weed has this bizarre adaptation that it produces sulfuric acid in its tissues. It doesn't hurt me when I'm touching it. It's not burning my skin or anything. But if I tried to eat it, or if a predator tried to eat it would not be a tasty thing for me to be eating, and it would probably cause my tummy to be very sick afterwards. So as a result, there aren't very many animals out there that can eat something that produces sulfuric acid. And in fact, if this was growing attached to the rocks, it would even have trouble living next to other kinds of seaweeds, because it could also use its acid to harm the other seaweeds in the vicinity. So it's a pretty dangerous looking seaweed. We have to be really careful with this one when we bring it back to the lab at BMSC. It has to have its own special aquarium, because we can't put it in with anything else, or it will harm the other creatures in our aquaria. So that's bad. Yeah, this one here, it's the same kind, but notice how the leaves are a little bit more kind of green and sick looking. And that's an example of the sulfuric acid working to help to dissolve the leaves themselves. Makes it very unappetizing for predators that try to eat this. In this case, it's digested most of itself, though, which is also a bit of a problem. So there's another fun find. Shall we look at some more animals under rocks? And are there any more questions coming through while we do that? Maybe. Let's look at here. Let's try this one. All right, here we go. Just like a bear. Excellent. There's another kind of crab here. So this one is a purple shore crab. We saw a porcelain crab before. This is a purple shore crab. They do get a little bit bigger than this, but not too much. And this one is also a girl. On the underside, you can see that sort of round lighthouse shape of the abdomen. And that is what's telling me it's a girl. If it was a boy, it would be more pointy like a lighthouse underneath instead of an igloo. So that is the purple shore crab. And again, very common under the rocks here of the beach. And also capable of being out of water for a few hours, it can be there and until the tide comes back up. But of course, it will be happier if I put it back under the rocks. So I'm going to do that before we leave this spot. I'm always very careful to return the rocks the same way that I found them so that I'm not disturbing any of the habitat for the creatures that are underneath. Let's keep going.
Hey, Kelly, Phil here.
Yeah, Phil's got a question.
Yeah, question from YouTube. Janaea Copperthorn, how do you tell the difference between purple shore crabs and porcelain crabs?
Sorry, I didn't catch the end of that question. Between purple shore crabs
and porcelain crabs. Yeah, and
oh,
your image is frozen a little bit for right now.
We're a little bit frozen. Let me see if I can just adjust Olivia's antenna here. Maybe that will help. We are also getting, it's starting to rain a little bit on the beach, so that might be interfering with our signal a little bit. The question is, how do you tell the difference between the porcelain crabs and the shore crabs? And at first glance, it's very difficult to tell, especially when you flip a rock and they all just scurry out of the way. But usually the claws themselves tell me, because the porcelain crabs have kind of bigger, musclier looking claws. They're not actually muscles. Oh, am I really frozen right now? I don't hear any answer. Let's go back this way, maybe. We're just gonna go back to where there's a better, yeah, we're gonna go back to where there's maybe a better signal so that we don't freeze so much. Is it getting better yet?
No, still don't see it. Maybe you could try to close the phone and then come back to it.
No, I don't think that's a good idea because it'll take us a while to get back into the program.
Well, I'm not saying turn it off. Just go put it to sleep and then pop it open like we did earlier.
Phil says you could try to put the program to sleep and then pop it open again like we did earlier. Yeah, we'll try that, see if the video comes back. I think they can hear us, but they can't see us.
That's right.
Okay, Olivia's working with the phone here, and hopefully it comes back because I found another animal to show you right by my feet. So I want to share that with you.
There's a question you could answer from Eric.
Sure.
He asks, can nudibranchs be found under rocks?
Aha, I love this question. So the question is about nudibranchs and can they be found here under rocks? Occasionally, you do have to be very lucky to find nudibranchs, and I haven't seen one yet today. A nudibranch, if you're wondering, is a sea slug, and so it's like a snail but without a shell. They come in all kinds of wild and crazy colors, and we have lots of different species of them here in BC. But I unfortunately have not seen one here yet today. So we'll let you know if one pops up. It's possible, but you gotta look extra hard for them. How's our video? Are you able to see me again?
Yeah, it's back on. The quality is not as good as it was, but you are back on and it's getting better.
Okay, well, I wanted to show you there's an animal by my feet here. And again, I always do this to you guys. I always show you animals that don't look like animals. In fact, this looks like a rock, but look at this. when I touch this rock, it's a squishy rock. It is not a rock. It is, in fact, an anemone, a giant green anemone, although it doesn't look green right now. And again, this is just an adaptation that it has because it's low tide. It's closed itself up into a ball. It's covered even in little bits of shells also to help protect. And basically, it's just surviving here in this closed up state until the tide can come back in. So it's a challenge for this anemone because it's out of the water. It is probably going to be heating up a lot. It can't be finding any food right now. It needs water to find its food. So it's not really a happy time for this anemone at the moment, but it's also a normal part of its daily life. The tide goes out, it closes up, it waits, and then in a few hours, the tide comes back in. It takes about 6 hours usually from the time that it's high tide all the way down to low tide, usually about 6 hours, at least around Bamfield it is. Great. We want to try and show you another tide pool. So we're going to try and head over to the other side of the beach. But if we lose our signal again, we'll abort that mission. Let's see how it goes. Oh, I just noticed there's a purple shore crab here by my feet. This one happens to be a boy. So on the underside now, it has this lighthouse shape. It's sort of pointy right there. And that's different from the one we saw earlier. So this one's a boy shore crab. The first one was a girl shore crab. So the question is, what is a benefit to living here in the intertidal zone versus somewhere where they stay underwater? Because it seems like a pretty tough place to live. And you're right, it is a tough place to live. But as you can see, all of the animals that we're exploring around here today, they all have special adaptations that allow them to live here. And so by coming into a difficult territory, either it's a good way for them to maybe find food, or maybe a good way for them to escape other predators that can't survive low tide. So the animals that can come here and wait out the time in the air on the surface, they do better than the animals maybe that can only survive in the water. But it is a tough place to survive for sure. You're right. Great. Let's head back towards our tide pool area here.
Another question while you're cruising there.
Yeah, thanks.
Claire's asking, do sea anemones live on shore?
Do sea anemones what?
Live on shore.
They do live on shore. They also live underwater. So sea anemones, there are more species that can live only underwater, but the giant green anemones, and I want to show you some here in just a moment, they can live out of the water, but they often close up, like we saw in the one that I poked that was like a squishy rock. But right here is a tide pool, and there's a giant green anemone in this tide pool that will actually look like a giant green anemone, so you can see what the tentacles are like. All right, Livy's gonna get this lined up. How's our signal? Are you guys still hearing and seeing us okay?
Yeah, it looks good from my end.
Great. So can you see the anemones in this tide pool? There are some that have nice green tentacles, and the green tentacles are they are a type of algae actually that live inside of the animal that is the anemone to give it that green color. It might help actually if I show you. I'm going to come back over there next to Olivia for a second, because right next to her is a really nice example of a green anemone that has all of its tentacles out. It's just a little bit hidden under some seagrass right now. So I'm just going to move this out of the way. So this is, again, another adaptation. There's all this seagrass growing in this tide pool, and lots of animals are hidden underneath if we just move it out of the way a little bit. So right down here is a giant green anemone. Sorry, I know there's a little bit of a glare on the screen that can't quite cover that up today. But that is what they look like when their tentacles are out and extended. And this one happened to find a tide pool to live in, so it doesn't quite have to suffer the ordeal of having the tide go out every day, because the water always remains in this little pool for this anemone to stay hydrated and keep from warming up too much. So that's a cool find. Yeah, let's I also just when I was adventuring around the side of this tide pool here, I did notice we are in luck today. To the person that asked the question about the nudibranchs on the shoreline, maybe Erica? There's one right here on the edge of our tide pool by my finger here. So it looks like a gray blob and it has some spots. It's called a leopard nudibranch. And so this is a sea slug that, again, it's capable of surviving out of the water for short periods of time only. On its back, it's got a spot here that's where its gills are located. They're retracted right now, so it's not really able to breathe too well at the moment, but it doesn't need to either because often many of these animals, they just sort of go into a state of um, dormancy when the tide goes out, and that's kind of what this one's doing. You don't see it moving around very much. Not that they move very fast anyway, but this one's just kind of hunkered down on the rocks, not doing much, waiting for the tide to come back in. That's a really cool find. Phil, there was a question that just came through on Zoom, but we didn't catch it.
Yeah. So Erica, does living in a tide pool mean the animals must withstand more temperature extreme changes?
Does living in the tide pool mean that animals have more temperature changes? Probably less than the animals that don't live in tide pools, but absolutely you're right. So because they don't have the regular ocean crashing in on them, over the course of the day when the tide is out, the tide pools tend to heat up a little bit. The temperature of the water in the tide pool could get really, really warm on a hot summer day. Or opposite, if it's winter time and it's really cold out, maybe that could be a problem for the animals as well. So it's a pretty difficult environment for all these species to be living. And they have to be very specially adapted in order to survive in this weird environment. Good thinking. I want to show you over on the other side of the tide pool here, there is some interesting seaweeds again. I know that some people here are probably interested in learning a little bit about the seaweeds. I have to walk very carefully because of all the rocks here. And same with Olivia too, as she's coming across the rocks with the camera. Forgive us if it's a little bit jostly. But we want to show you this really interesting seaweed covered rock here next to our tide pool. So these are some seaweeds that are showing a really great example of being able to survive out of the water. And Olivia's going to show you their interesting adaptation. These ones are like little water balloons. Can you see that? She's squeezing it and it's squirting out a little stream of water. There you go. So what they've done, they've learned to adapt to life in the intertidal zone by just keeping a little supply of water inside themselves at all times so they can't dry out. And then they're fine to just wait a few hours. No big deal. The other interesting thing about this area of the beach, there's another seaweed right here. And this is one of my favorite ones actually, because this is nori, which is sushi seaweed. If you like to eat sushi, this is the kind of seaweed that you're eating. I know it looks different than when it's wrapped around the rice and stuff, but this is the live version of it before it gets dried and pressed into those little papers. So this is in fact edible, and I really like this one. So I'm going to keep this for a little snack later on. How are we doing for questions? Are there any more coming through?
There was one more asking if, why do you think that nudibranch would be on the edge of the tide pool outside as opposed to being inside the water or under the water?
I'm not sure actually. So I think that the nudibranch probably didn't quite judge the tide properly when it was choosing its spot to hunker down, and maybe it thought that the water wasn't going to go out as far as it did. So it probably will, it'll be fine for a few hours until the tide does come back in, but it would be usually better for an animal if it could still last in the water rather than out of the water. But won't be too long and the tide will come back in again. So I think we're getting to the end of our show here. Phil, we should go back to you so that you can do the draw to figure out who wins the toque.
Okay, I can do that. So thank you everyone for your comments and questions. And I have your names right here. Yeah, really, I'm just gonna reach my hand in, pick a name. The winner of today's toque is Claire. Claire,
Awesome,
you are
congratulations.
on YouTube through Aaron K. Matheson. So send us so that's through YouTube, so we don't have your contact information. So please send it to our email address, fieldtrips@bamfieldmsc.com, and we will get a red toque. This toque right here, coming at you, Claire. Well done.
Congratulations. Thank you to everybody for joining us on today's show. And don't forget to tune in again next week. We'll be offering a new show where we are out on the Alta again, but doing something different next week. So stay tuned for that. I'd like to say one more thank you to my team members here today, to Olivia behind the camera there for helping to bring the video to you here today, and also to Phil back in the lab for helping out as well. You can always visit our website at bmsc.com if you want to learn more about what we're doing here. And it's time to say goodbye. So until next week, goodbye.